Hello and welcome to our online discussion Voices of Resolution 1325 Women, Peace and Participation. This event is organized by the strategic Think and Do Tank Shapka and was funded by the City of Vienna. Let me introduce you to our wonderful speakers for this event before we jump directly into the introduction of the topic by the moderator Andrea Warnecke. The first speaker is Karashvili. She is a professional physicist, but after the Abkhazian War in the early 90s, she was displaced and co-founded the IDP Women Association Consent. With this NGO based in Georgia, she supports displaced women and actively participates in the creation and monitoring process of the Georgian National Action Plan on WPS. She's member of the High-Level Advisory Group for the Global Study on the Impact of the United Nations Resolution 1325, as well as on the NATO Civil Society Advisory Panel on WPS. Furthermore, she has worked for a Georgian ministry as Deputy Director in the International Relations Department to organize assistance for IDPs in the occupied territory. She is also engaged in further United Nations Women programs. Nothando Maphalala is a mediation and advisory officer for the Femwise Africa Network in the African Union's mission in South Sudan in Juba. She has worked on women, peace and security, gender policies, post-conflict transition, and peace building at the Life and Peace Institute, as well as at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. Erika Wichro is a medical doctor and has worked in the humanitarian field in countries such as Afghanistan, Ghana, Syria, and Sierra Leone. Her expertise in health emergencies brought her to both the World Health Organization and the European Commission to fight against polio, Ebola, and measles. As international public health expert, she also works in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic in Austria. Furthermore, she is CEO and international consultant at Peacebuilding and Partners Stahl. To properly address this issue, Andrea Warnecke will now give us a brief introduction to the Resolution 1325.
1st of October 2000, the United Nations Security Council, after a very long multi-layered campaigning process, adopted entitled Women, Peace and Security. With this resolution, the Security Council not only recognized the disproportionate impact of armed conflict on women, but also highlighted the specific role that women and that gender play in conflict and conflict resolution. The Security United Nations members to mainstream gender and gender equality throughout their security policy and conflict management agendas, with a particular emphasis, of course, on women's access to political decision-making. The resolution over the past 20 years has, of course, ensured that the role of women and the gender dimension, ranging from issues such as gender-based violence in conflict, sexual violence or sexualized violence as a weapon of war, but also the specific role and need of women in the post-war phase, has remained high on the international agenda. At the same time, we are still a long full acknowledgements of gender in peace and conflict, and of course not only in peace and conflict. So against this backdrop, we want to use the present anniversary. It's now been a bit more than 20 years, to reflect on the progress that has been made so far and try and identify some main challenges in regard to realizing 1325, both internationally but also in specific situations of conflict and post-conflict. The organizers have organized some overarching themes and questions that our panelists will explore across their talks and that we also hope to discuss following the panel. And later on, what has been the effect of Resolution 1325 and of related resolutions in regard to the work conducted at the national and regional levels? To what extent have the goals of Resolution 1325 been achieved, and where are our main challenges? And lastly, how has the agenda for achieving women's participation and equality in conflict evolved in the past 2 years, in the past 2 decades, and where is it headed now? And of course, we will address recent and ongoing developments such as the corona pandemic, but also larger global developments on the policy level, the outcome of the recent US election. I very much look forward to the keynote speaks. To let our audience know, we will now have 3 of 10 to 12 minutes each, followed by a first round of moderators' questions, and will then open the floor for a hopefully engaging and lively discussion and question and comments. And with the floor to Julia Karashvili for your first keynote, please.
Good evening to everybody, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for invitation to speak on this meeting. I represent a non-governmental organization, IDP Women Association Consent. It's an organization which was created by women and for women to help them in post-war crisis in Georgia. Consent works already 25 years in Georgia, in South Caucasian region, and also in former Soviet Union region, through regional women's platform for peace dialogue. We started after bloody war in Georgia, which took thousands of lives and led to displacement of more than 250,000 people. With population of approximately 4 million, it was catastrophic. And women were the first who started self-organizing and work for their community. IDP community for many years became the main target group for our work, providing opportunities, informal education, empowerment for IDP women. Also later, Consent, our organization, started more ambitious projects, advocating for changes in legislation, promotion of women's rights, and informing policies of country in sphere of IDPs and peace building. As there were also conflicts simultaneously in other parts of South Caucasian region, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, because it was all related with breaking of empire of Soviet Union. So we tried also to join forces with civil societies from these countries, and first sub-regional space for civil dialogue was created, first under Geneva CIS Conference on Migration, and later within different networks and projects. Conflict and post-conflict situation really changed gender roles in our quite traditional societies, especially in IDP community, which usually is more traditional. Women became main breadwinners due to losses of men, due to high migration, which originally was more masculine. And at the same time, their new role was not seen by society as precondition for their public participation and involvement in politics. Slowly, women started to gain position, at least in civil society. And Resolution 1325 was seen by women's organization as universal instrument which can help women both in realization of their rights, but also in peace building, because for Georgian society and for Georgian women, especially those affected by conflict, peace building and establishing of trust was extremely important. Unfortunately, regardless of all our efforts, only after new war in 2008, government heard our voices and started to work on national action plan for Resolution 1325. Georgia was the first country which approved such plan among post-Soviet countries. But even today, when we have already third action plan, we see National Action Plan as the only document which really is working on peace building and women inclusion on this process. The National Action Plan proposed many changes, including creation of institutional mechanisms. First, it was Coordinational Council, and NGO had opportunity to participate. And the plan included all four components: participation, prevention, protection, and early rehabilitation. But more emphasis were made on security forces, as in many other action plans. Unfortunately, all three action plans had the same problem. They were not costed, and also they were not involving women from separated by war territories, from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And of course, you cannot build real, stable peace from one side. You need participation and creation. And it's why we were thinking about regionalization. we were thinking that regional action plan will provide more security and more opportunities to women from all 6 regions in the South Caucasus affected by conflict. We were not thinking that it can fully prevent violence, but we thought it will create some additional avenue to discuss women's security and human security of people. As Resolution 1325 is quite universal mechanism and should be equally accepted for any countries, so National Action Plan provides more specific opportunities, but even in very small Georgia, which is now less than 4 million population, we have very different situation for women affected by conflict in different places. And it's why we decided to go to localization of National Action Plan. And we started in 2017 together with Global Network of Women Peace Builders and in framework of projects supported by Austrian Development Agency. And thank you again to Austria for this. And then it was more widened already with Young Women and other components. And this process of localization gave us opportunity to work in whole region of Eastern Partnership countries with 5 from 6 countries affected by conflict, and to build horizontal relations and to share like good practices, but also failures and lessons learned, which sometimes is even more important than sharing of only good practices. As I already mentioned, women's NGO in South Caucasus were cooperating very closely. In 2018, also by support and advocacy from civil society, Armenia approved first National Action Plan, and we planned to help with localization by sharing our experience, how to work with local government and how to put priorities of women from grassroots in budgets, and how to teach women to monitor these budgets, to push local governments, and how to give them voice and to amplify their voices, that they will be heard by government, also by central government. In Azerbaijan, Women's NGO also prepared the plan, but it was not accepted for the moment of escalation of violence. This year, in 2020, when we had already so many challenges, there were some attempts to make more deep implementation of 1325 in the region and globally. In November, OSCE Gender Unit brought women from South Caucasus together, and we were trying, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Georgian women were discussed issues how we can work in network and how this network can help in prevention and on helping in women's rights and gender equality. In February, there were 2 big events. It was Global Peace Forum in Vienna, organized by GNVP, and it was again South Caucasus women, also from unrecognized entity, meeting with women from Western Balkans, who had very huge experience in peaceful unification in women lobby to governments, to bring women in politics and to bring women voice to peace agreements. Situation of COVID strongly influenced abilities of civil society for cooperation and new actions. Women were affected in the first line as caregivers, as working in informal sector, and also as medical personnel. In May, June, our association tried to make meetings of Women Peace Builders platform, also involving OSCE and ambassadors of OSCE. And women peace builders from Armenia and Azerbaijan were voicing already their concerns that they see signs of coming possible violation and revival of conflict. As always, women's voices are not very much heard. And even when conflict starts, mainly international organizations invite for discussion think tanks and men experts who of course have a huge knowledge, but who do not see some of core causes of conflict and situation in communities, which also is very important to understand and to see when we are talking about possible revival of protracted conflicts. I really want once more to bring your attention to phenomena of protracted displacement, which is very unified in South Caucasus, now already in Ukraine and in Moldova, and which is like this covered fire. You know, you never know when it can be opened again and who can use it for political reasons. Because when people for 30 years are living in limbo without a real understanding, also always saying that they will return and that political settlement will come, etc., it is very easy to use for any escalations of conflict. Unfortunately, voices of women were not heard, and the first escalation happened in July. It was closed quite quickly, and on 27th of September and started full war. Rebecca, can you please show the map?
So, here we go.
I just want to show you how complicated is our South Caucasus, where after Soviet period, we see that some enclaves are within of territories of our conflicted countries. And you can see that in Azerbaijan territory, it's Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Armenian territory, it's Nakhichevan, populated by Azerbaijani. And so what's happened is that 44 days, it was very bloody conflict, which took thousands of lives of young people, and also there were some weapons used from both sides, like cassette bombs, which took lives also of peaceful population, including women and including children. And it was difficult. It was difficult, especially time for women peace builders, who already before the escalation started, start to feel certain tension and violence against them, sometimes even physical violence. And in both countries, it was anti-gender movement and movement which prevented them for really making statements. So we always talk about safety and security of women peace builders, and it was one of recommendations of global study. And we always ask that it should be the same status as human rights defenders, that women will have some special status and some special protection also from EU. But till now, we could not achieve it. And when we expect that civil society will solve the problems on the ground, which are not solved by Minsk group and which are not solved by EU and UN. But nevertheless, women still are ready. And I can tell you the Georgian organizations, we were in constant each day contact with our organizations, friend organizations from Armenia, both from Armenia and Azerbaijan, with women peace activists, trying to investigate what are the current needs and how we can help and to whom we can apply to stop violence. As you know, 2 days before, very sudden announcement about peace agreement when Russian peacekeepers were immediately placed in zone of Nagorno-Karabakh. It's green on your picture. They needed to go through territory of Georgia, Armenia by flight to assess. And it will be created center of monitoring of conflict, which will be also managed by Russia and by Turkey. Such kind of decision stopped bloody war, which we very much appreciated, but it puts a lot of questions. How will be new reality in South Caucasus? How will be geopolitical situation and what civil society can do in this case, and how we can use mechanisms which we traditionally use, like 1325. One more problem is related to complete lack of trust. Parties do not trust each other. Currently, already nobody trusts Russia, and civil society in Armenia and Azerbaijan, influenced by war and different provocation, for the moment needs outside support to restart talks and dialogue. In the first line, to assess threats and positive sides of this agreement, to start work on protection of civilians, especially in zones of return and of peacekeeping location, start urgent assessment of needs of displaced and conflict-affected people, and crisis intervention, psychological intervention, humanitarian assistance, and human rights monitoring, and places alongside division line. We believe that civil organizations from Georgia region, and especially from EU, can help and play a role of facilitators and mediators, bring together this organization to continue and to revive dialogue, which is very important for this moment. And as the third step for reconciliation, we propose some humanitarian actions related with psychological assistance to both parties, which will be done through local NGOs with our support, women's networks and regional platform for women's dialogue is ready and started already actions. We think that regional framework could allow to restart dialogue of women's organization and will help to provide them with security and safety. Thank you very much, and if there will be questions, I will be ready to answer.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was already a lot of rich material. Come back to your talk in the discussion. Thank you very much for now. I'd hand the floor over to Notes, who will speak about the work of Women, Peace and Security in South Sudan.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Shavka, for the invitation and to be a part of this important conversation, and thank you to everybody that is listening and participating. I think I'd first like to begin by mentioning that, you know, women have always been affected, but also have been involved in conflicts as combatants, as peace builders, as humanitarians, but the engagement as well as the effect of conflict on them was not always recognized. And I think it's important to personalize some of the abstract concepts that will follow in some of the things that I'll mention by beginning with a visual introduction and with some images of some people that I hope will resonate with you and that you will begin to associate women, peace and security in South Sudan. Rebecca, may you please? Yes, we can start from the very top. Okay, so this photo was taken we're not quite sure when, but it was in the 1980s. And in 1984, the leader of the liberation movement for South Sudan and Dr. John Garang sought to incorporate women into the resistance movement. And this became the Katiba Banat, or the Women's Battalion. And those are the women that you see in that image. And these women in 1986 demanded a unit that would address women's affairs. Today we would call this a women's wing. And it was called the Commission for Women, Youth and Social Welfare. And today in post-independent South Sudan, it became known as the Ministry of Gender and Social Affairs. Image number 2, photo number 2, if you can, Rebecca, if you can, yes, the second slide, is of Commander Aga Gam, and she abandoned a career as a very famous singer and songwriter to become a freedom fighter for the liberation of Southern Sudan. She ended up heading the intelligence unit and was commanding officer for both male and female soldiers following the outbreak of conflict between Southern Sudan and Sudan in 1983. Unfortunately, she passed on in 2000 and she did not get to witness the liberation of South Sudan. And then we have photo number 3. And I think we may all be quite familiar with this image, and this depicts the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And this was a significant event, and that fundamentally changed the world. And yet it still influences the many ways that we think about conflict resolution and the way we think about negotiations. This was 1648, and it still has a bearing on so much that we do around negotiations. I think that's the end of those images. I think it's worth noting that Resolution 1325 is older than the country South Sudan, which only gained independence 9 years ago. And as such, it came into being at a time when the women, peace and security agenda was already well established in the global policy lexicon. Secondly, the state of South Sudan is the result of an internal struggle and multiple wars, but it's also a result of multilateralism and Pan-Africanism done right. A Ghanaian colleague of mine in South Sudan would often say to me, if South Sudan fails, we have failed. And in South Sudan today, there is a large multilateral presence, from a UN peacekeeping mission, an African Union mission, and most international organizations that operate in the world today have a presence and are implementing projects in South Sudan. And so one of the questions that I asked myself was how come there has not been a meaningful translation of the women, peace and security agenda in South Sudan, given these unique circumstances, and circumstances which on the surface would give the country somewhat of a head start in prioritizing women's participation and representation. Now, I hope to answer some of these questions and perhaps to sort of pique your own as well. Currently, South Sudan is in its second year of implementing its second post-independence peace agreement. Now, this one was signed in September 2018. Now, while those who signed on behalf of the parties to the conflict were men, 7 of the 17 civil society signatories were women. And achieving this level of representation was hard-won and was an outcome of extensive lobbying. In South Sudan, women made up 25% of the delegates who were part of the 2018 negotiations. Their participation then resulted in the agreement of all parties to a 35% quota for women in all levels of government. Now, while this 25% of participation is slightly higher than the global average, on average, women's participation is at 10%, it is still insufficient. 30 African countries so far have developed national action plans for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and South Sudan launched its National Action Plan in 2015. Now, the National Action Plan provides a roadmap to protect women from sexual and gender-based violence and aspires to increase women's participation in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, the maintenance of peace and security, and to guarantee their participation in post-conflict peace building as well as state building processes. So like Julia mentioned, those 4 pillars that the agenda covers. However, without the appropriate financing and the political will at the highest level, it has become a document that only exists in paper. In February this year, a transitional government was formed, and with 44 cabinet ministers, very few of those were women, although women do hold some key positions. Currently, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Parliamentary Affairs are all women. This still did not meet the 35% that is a requirement as stipulated in the peace agreement. While there was a significant response to this violation, and it must be, and it's really key for the parties to realize that this is a violation to the peace agreement. The expectation and the response from the parties was that this lack of representation was going to be made up for in the subsequent appointments. Out of the 10 state governors that were appointed, only 1 was a woman, again, a violation of the 35% affirmative action. And at present, essentially the 35% requirement has been violated in all the appointments since the formation of the government. Now, there is no punitive measure for not implementing these commitments. Now, significant barriers remain in South Sudanese women's equal participation. The selection criteria, as we saw above, of who gets to be at the peace table and then subsequently who gets to be in government, prioritizes those who have been directly involved in the wars. This automatically excludes the majority of women, children, as well as disadvantaged and ordinary men. Furthermore, the models for mediation and negotiated settlements for conflict rarely take into account the power dynamics that exist between the warring parties, between women and men, among communities, as well as among women. Peace agreements, and South Sudan is not an exception, are ultimately elite settlements, which is why more than 50% of peace agreements break down within 5 years of signature, is the lack of inclusivity. Now, this model poses significant challenges for women's meaningful participation. In South Sudan, women have had to organize informally and through all kinds of informal and often unrecognized processes with some support, although this is not a consistent form of funding or support, they were able to at least present at the table even if they were not considered parties to the conflict. The second hurdle is also the assumption that women are monolithic and that in a conflict situation, all women wanted was to resolve the conflicts. As we see presently, women are as divided as men on the basis of political party, on the basis of ethnicity, and there are also mutual suspicions, allegiances, and interests among women that may not always be in sync with the broader WPS agenda. Let me start to summarize. The age divide is also a challenge. In January this year, we held a training workshop for young South Sudanese women on peace advocacy. And what we heard was that they felt marginalized twice. First, for being a woman, and secondly, for being young. And in a patriarchal society such as South Sudan, older women are often conferred with privileges as defenders of patriarchy, including as gatekeepers. Now, South Sudanese women's organizations and CBOs exist, and they are vibrant and dynamic. However, they lack the direct multi-year core funding to organize on their own, to build their constituencies, to gain nationwide legitimacy, and to raise their issues. Finally, women must be able to understand and interpret their local politics, but more importantly, how to link these to global politics, to the arms race, to defense spending, to local conflicts, to DDR, and to wars. It is only when women's participation is seen as a fully fledged political process and not as an add-on that women's meaningful participation will be achieved. And finally, as I was putting together this presentation and reflecting on my deployment in South Sudan, it dawned on me the credibility challenge that international organizations potentially face in implementing the women, peace, and security agenda when we ourselves have not normalized women's participation. In my mission, I was the only woman officer, and unless I was meeting with other gender officers, I was often the only woman in meetings. The few other women I know observe the same. Partners, donors, international organizations must also exhibit the stated objectives of women, peace, and security, and normalizing women's participation provides a much more credible basis for advocating for this agenda. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that we came to the end of the time exactly at the point where you went into the different, the kind of specifics of the aspects that make it difficult for women. Once again, I've taken a note and we come back to that issue and look forward to hearing more from you in the discussion round. I'll now hand over to Erika, Dr. Erika Wichro, please, for our third keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the world, whoever is listening. I'm really delighted, and I thank the organizers very much for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak in such a high level, wonderful female panel. My topic is actually going to be about peace building and healthcare, but also the importance of healthcare. And as you all know, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is on one of the topics which is probably mostly discussed nowadays. Now, before I get into that one, I would actually like to share my personal experience from somebody who has been working in conflict-prone countries, as like the previous speakers were talking about, being the only officer, being supervisor of various male colleagues, and also from the perspective of really looking into analyzing disrupted healthcare systems, but in this context, looking how healthcare actually contributes to peace building. If we look back a little bit in time, there has been a Spanish flu, there has been, world wars, there has been a series of conflicts, endless conflicts, if one could say so, because there were bigger ones, there were smaller ones, countless. And in all of them, or in all of that, women always played a role, at least at the front line. They have not been necessarily at the decision-making levels. They have not necessarily been engaged in the peace building processes, but at the end of the day, they were engaged at the front line. They were unfortunately also part of the vulnerable groups, along with children and also with elderly persons. So coming to that and really going back into the field, for instance, the time I spent in Afghanistan was incredibly enlightening for me, because the socio-cultural context, you know, me coming from Vienna, from Austria, being a European, having the privilege to really travel a lot, having the privilege to study a lot, being quite empowered, is a different perspective from somebody who hasn't been able to neither to experience that kind of privileges, but also has never even thought about that something like this would be possible. So the socio-cultural background is incredibly important, and I learned so much from the people in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, you know, across the globe, wherever I have gone to. And this social context, particularly when it comes to healthcare, I also experienced in Rwanda, where I was writing, when I was writing my master thesis on how public health and the approach was actually contributing in a peace building process. Because what has been mentioned there is not only connecting the grassroots with those on top making the decisions, but really engaging with women very much at all levels. We know that women are incredibly important. They keep the household together, if one may say so. They are usually the finance minister in their households, and they are doing quite well. Important decisions made are usually women. However, on the outside, it might actually appear that it's the male who has taken the decision. So going back to the healthcare system, what we also noticed in the different countries where conflict has been occurring, whether it's Syria or any other of the countries, women were always telling me it is quite difficult to go and seek healthcare if one does not feel like there is a safe space, particularly when healthcare settings are a target, as we saw in Syria, which is still happening, unfortunately. Or if you feel like that the professionals, meaning the healthcare workers, are not really paying attention to female complaints, that there might not there might be no accessibility, there might be no availability in terms of healthcare settings, or there might be no availability of medication and treatment. So I think if we consider health as one of the biggest human assets, and the healthcare settings as a place for peace building, it even more so is evidently that this is so important. Women need to be not only on the front line, but they need to be in the decision-making positions at various levels. And I think what I really appreciate about the two previous speakers, they really hit the nail by pointing out the importance of the political will, because the political will actually frames the legal context or the legal frame. And with that, it depends on who is making the law for whom. And once you have the law, of course, there's also the big component of, for me, the important component of communication. Who do we actually target as, who do we talk to? The same applies to the pandemic. Who do we actually address? Who do we want to do what? For which purpose? How do we collect data? Because what I noticed over time and also recently is data can be used in various ways. So we can use data to really help point out an issue and to really try to solve the problem with that, or it could be used otherwise. So I think we are having so many beautiful tools, but it all comes back to political will, it comes back to leadership. It comes back to the need for women to be put in decision-making positions at all levels, because we do have incredibly capable women. We do have women who are ready and willing and capable of speaking up, but they need to be given a space and a voice and a safe space to actually do so. Coming back to the safe space, particularly at healthcare settings, when one exposes oneself, this is a place where there should be really confidentiality. There should be the possibility to speak, to really share concerns and to get proper advice, regardless whether a person belongs to this party or to another party of conflict, or, you know, to whatever the local issue might be. Unfortunately, it's still not happening yet. And that comes back to, you know, how things are set up. That was a big lesson learned in Rwanda, for instance, where, as mentioned also before already, access to healthcare was actually weaponized, and some people just haven't been given the proper healthcare or no healthcare whatsoever. Another important thing which we learned throughout the time, and also I learned from country to country, is there's got to be an intersectorial engagement. Right now, there's a lot of fractioning, there's a lot of sectorial thinking, there's a lot of, how shall I say, wonderful ideas coming from outside, but they are probably not as practical, they are probably not as usable, especially user-friendly for women in the local settings, because when one comes from outside, and I learned it myself and I'm seeing it everywhere I'm going, I actually like to listen. Whether it was in Sierra Leone, where I was there during the Ebola crisis in 2014, where people were still very fragile, in a very fragile state, just kind of overcoming the civil unrest, and then having Ebola literally wiping out almost a third or a half of the population. So resources were scarce. Health workers were really diminished. You know, then the leadership was just in the development. Many incredible, lots of help coming from outside, but also, let's face it, there is a different agenda, there is a different work ethics from time to time, and maybe this kind of common goal might be diverted a little bit. So I'm really taking the possibility to put the things on the table, because what I learned also was, when people start trusting one, it really means that there's got to be a safe space to speak out the truths, to speak out the different perspectives, to speak out what is the concern of everybody involved in this process. And I think peace building only works if we really get to the core of being vulnerable, because as human beings, we are in every aspect, with all respect. But at the same time, we also need to particularly think about women who are usually in a much less supported arena and do have less to no voice. So what I would like to say is, and I'll get back to the COVID pandemic, because I think it's also something which can really show there's a time of uncertainty. Every conflict is so. We are encouraged not to hold on too much to the way we have been doing things, because the COVID pandemic actually showed and is pinpointing where the gaps are. Now is a wonderful opportunity to close those gaps, particularly when it comes to 1325, because it really shows that there is still not as many women on the table for the whole process of peace building as there should be. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Erika, also for this discussion and reflection on safe spaces in different humanitarian settings. We have about 45 minutes now for discussion, and I would like to start us off some brief specific questions in response to each of the talks. There'll also be a question that is basically the same for every one of us, and other than that, after that, we'll open the floor for overall discussions. Any questions and thoughts have you free to share them in the chat. Rebecca and I will be monitoring them and make sure that these questions will be addressed. Now, coming back to all three talks, and especially the first and Nothando's notes talk, I was very intrigued by what you said about the link and the translation between UN Security Resolution 1325 at the global governance level and how it is being translated into International Action Plan. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah, International Action Plan. So how does this translation work? How do we have to imagine this working? Julia, you were already saying that there have been 3 such action plans already. In your case, in South Sudan, if I remember correctly, there is 1. I don't know to what extent you've been involved in that, but I think it would be interesting for all of us to hear how this process works. To what extent is this a government-led process, or are there also opportunities for NGOs, CSOs, and other groups, civil society, to get involved? So, in short, who decides which parts of UN Resolution 1325 are important in a given setting? Secondly, I would also like to pick up on one of the issues that you mentioned, Julia. The cooperation across the regions. And I found that point really interesting, and you kind of alluded to the fact that much would be that there's a problem, if I understood correctly, in facilitating or in harnessing this cooperation among women and women's groups from these different regions. And I was wondering, I hope I understood that correctly, if you could elaborate a bit on that. To what extent has this already been the case? And what is the promise in doing that? Why would that be such an important aspect? Secondly, for Nothando, the question, which is where I gave you the time sign, which I immediately regretted because he was speaking about, which I think is a key issue, how women are exactly not monolithic. It's not just because women are women. Are they immediately interested in peace or in conflict resolution? There are different ethnic, age-related or generational, political and so on identities and positions and interests. And especially when it comes to trying to involve women, as you said, in regard to the peace agreements, in regard to the National Action Plan, what is your experience? Do you have any ideas, experiences in how to work with this diversity? Is it that women can be motivated to cooperate despite these differences, or is it just the same as we've seen before women was more strongly integrated? And secondly, on your point in regard to IO representation, the representation of women in international organizations, I thought it was incredibly interesting to hear from your experience. And I'm wondering, is there any attempt among female staff in these organizations to advocate for better representation? Are there any kind of women's professional networks, mentoring programs, and so on, to kind of strengthen the representation? Finally, on Erika's talk, I was really curious by what you said about the gaps that have become obvious in regard to COVID. And of course, I'm wondering, given your experience in regard to the fight against Ebola and other health crises in all these different settings, what is it about the current pandemic or the current health crisis, other than its sheer scale, that has made this lack so obvious? How different? And are there any experiences from your earlier work, and especially from working with the World Health Organization, that could be helpful now, that could, for instance, also help us in countries of the global north, for instance, change the way we address this? Because we usually always kind of by default think the other way around. But here in Europe, at least, I think, as far as I understand, the last epidemic or pandemic is 100 years ago, and I think people were entirely taken. I certainly didn't think this was possible, and I wonder, society that have had this terrible experience before and more repeatedly, are there any coping strategies, any forms of social mobilization that you have experienced and that could help us come to terms, especially with a degree of distrust and opposition to current policies? Shall we start with Julia again, to give everybody time to respond?
I will try to be quick, not, but questions are very interesting, and thank you for them. Yes, when we say resolution 1325, we always think about whole complex of resolutions, not only about the 1325, which gives the name to women, peace and security, women and peace and security, and it's always some contradictions, because we are talking about women as peace building, and at the same time about women and increase of number of women in military operations. And it's always a little bit difficult to balance all these things, which I also will be very happy to hear later from participants of discussions. For Georgia, as for a country which had protracted displacement and protracted conflict, it was very important to stress issues related with rights of internally displaced women, economic empowerment, and especially participation in peace talks. We have only one official talks. It's not really peace talks because we do not sign peace agreement. It's a Geneva international discussions, and it's very close process where civil society had no possibility to put our nose. Even women had ideas and had proposals, and they were, for years, they were demanding their voice. And now, from the second action plan, we have the opportunity that women will regularly meet only with Georgian part of participants of Geneva discussions, sometimes after, sometimes before, and gave them instructions. What is important for women? What kind of problems we see as the core problems? And as we do not have access, because it's high-level political process, and facilitators, international facilitators, also always are saying that it's highly politicized process, the opportunity which was found that we have separate meetings with political actors and also with facilitators, when women put on the table our proposals and our requirements. The main now here is to harmonize proposals from women from all three regions involved in Geneva facilitation. Yeah? From Georgia central government, central controlled area, and from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Talking about localization, as I told, we have a huge number, like 7% of population are internally displaced. And of course, majority are women. But we have second category of conflict-affected women. It's women who live alongside the conflict division line. And because there is borderization, I will not explain it, but it means that the de facto border division line is constantly moving inside of Georgian territory, which is controlled by central government, and so we lost our lands which women are working on, and that it's kidnappings and other events. So in different municipalities, we can have many IDPs, or we can have many people who are affected by conflict and different priorities. Why to put to bring 1325 to solve concrete problem of concrete women, which is suffering, for instance, for loss of land due to conflict, or for a loss of husband, and that she is now breadwinner and needs economic empowerment, are a little bit different, and we need that municipalities will understand it and include in their plans and budgets. What about participation of civil society? In the first action plan, civil society participated very actively. We have special working groups, 30 NGOs, 150 women from the ground, and it was a little bit more wish list because we wanted to put everything. The second plan was very strict because government told, let's ask to put what we can do, what is doable, but still it was not fully implemented because of money also, and also because of opportunities for conflict resolution. The third plan, again, we tried to advocate, and we could put things which were very important for civil society. It's creation of pilot system of early warning at community level, and it's psychological rehabilitation, because we have protracted conflict which happened 25, 30 years ago, and psychological traumatization still is here, and it's very difficult to convince government that still these people are victims of war and still need rehabilitation. So we could involve it. And now when the fourth plan is on pipeline, we also work with special advisor to Prime Minister on gender equality and human rights, and all network which we help to facilitate of grassroots women from all conflict affected villages and regions participates in creation of proposals. We don't know what will be accepted. It was not yet discussed on high level, but we will put everything on the table. And cooperation between boundaries, I think, is a core issue now. How we can help to our sisters in Armenia, Armenian and Azerbaijani women, is to create for them safe space for dialogue. We think that regional framework always is more safe for people, because presence of different regions, first of all, show another conflicts and another dimensions, and also do not make this bilateral, which usually governments who are in conflict do not accept. So it's kind of preserving of their security and safety, and also bringing, let's say, our inputs. And we think that we will do it constantly, because in this case, in case like emergency needs now, when we need to help with humanitarian needs to newly displaced and also to people in protracted displacement, such consolidate actions and women input, because we know situation in the ground, we know the real need in communities. Women are doing cooking, women are doing breadwinning, women are doing water supply, everything are done by women. We can, maybe will not speak about very high politics, but we know the needs and we know the resources how to cover it. So I think that creation of such dialogue, support of OSCE and support of European Union are crucial now, also to give hope to these people, because after war, people are hopelessness, and this depression and deepened by war and deepened by full limbo in which these people are now, and also not understandable how it will be developed in future. So we think that it's necessary urgently to help to civil society and to women's organization in whole region. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. That was very more than a half hours, but just so you to keep in mind, we do have some time afterwards for networking and for continuing. Nothando, would you?
Yes, I hope I'm not unmute. To respond to the first question, which was on the link between, on translating 1325 into national action plans. And in South Sudan, the development of the National Action Plan was led by the Ministry of Women, Child and Gender Affairs. And that process began in 2013. And it was with a lot of help from the UN Women as well as UNDP. There was a UN Women consultant that was brought on to develop the modalities for the action plan. And it was a widely consultative process. It began in, if you can imagine, it began in 2013, and the National Action Plan was finally published in 2015. And there were consultations community-wide, nationwide, in all 10 of the states at that time. And finally, ultimately, the National Action Plan, by all accounts, is a very broad, and it is a very inclusive action plan. However, like I said, it was developed in 2015, and presently it is outdated, because since it was published, there has been a second peace agreement. And one of the suggestions that we have made was that there needs to be a second national action plan, which incorporates, the provisions of the peace agreement and is more aligned with those provisions. And I think that would be one of the at least one aspect that would kind of make that more of a living document. And as again, as I said earlier, the aspect of political will and the financing to make sure that it is actually implemented is a huge, huge challenge. The second question you asked me was about how to work with the differences between women. And I'm not quite sure if, I mean, I think that ultimately South Sudanese women, because they had the CPA, they've had the first agreement, and this is now the second agreement. South Sudanese women, in their differences, when it came down to it, were able to coalesce and were able to bring forth a shared agenda in those critical moments. But I think it's important to also, and I think it's important that we realize that women are not monolithic, and it is important that urban women have a place to, or have avenues to talk about what they need. That rural women have means to express their needs, and that young women and that more mature women have their spaces. But I think one thing that we have found, though, when it comes down to peace agreements, and I think there's an actual study that that points this out, was that women more likely to build coalition and bridge their own divides to advocate for peace. And that there has been, at least in 40 peace processes that were studied, there has been no women's group that had attempted to derail any process. And so I think it's important that when it comes down to the collective good, women generally get together and advocate for that. But I think also in our everyday lives, I think those differences are important, as long as they don't divide us, that is. Thirdly, you mentioned about women's professional networks, and in terms of 1325 amongst international organizations. And when you sort of read a bit of my bio, you mentioned that I was a member of FemWise. And FemWise is a network of African women in conflict resolution and mediation. And its attempt is to address some of these issues that come up in terms of professional women in the mediation space, and creating an avenue and a network for both professionalizing women's role, but also a space for mentorship. And I'm happy to see that my mentor, Stella Sabiti, is actually part of this webinar right now. And that kind of goes to show that there are attempts to sort of build these spaces and to expand them as well. Yes.
Great, thank you very much for that. That's really interesting. And I'm really interested. Perhaps you could share it in the chat.
Andrea, sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, sorry, I think I just interrupted. The study that you mentioned, yes. I think that would be fascinating to maybe also share with, again, not to put you on the spot, but if you had something interesting for many of us. Erika, please. May I hand over?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm trying to share the screen. Let me see if so somebody disabled me. I would like to share the screen with a slide which I just would like to use to show you the gaps in terms of the crisis management, which so this one slide summarizes, because you were asking me in terms of the gaps. I think when we look back, it's not really a matter that we haven't been going through crises with the generations before us and so forth. It's a matter of what have we learned from those crises. And I've been also working with the emergency medical teams for the WHO in the Pacific. And when you look and compare those countries which do from the start have scarce resources, they are much better organized when it comes to getting resources, because they are quite focused, I would say, whereas countries who are more wealthier, they might have not that much of that focus. And I'm generalizing now a little bit, but this is my impression overall. I look at the crisis management, and we, amongst our experts circles, we do exchange, and I have been gathering the wisdom. And I think it's actually, the observation was, a new reality is hard to adopt, and that's really true. The issue here is clinging on to the old non-functional cross-sectorial silo approaches. And that's something unfortunate also, because you somehow try to hold on to what you think might be functioning, but when it looks nice on the outside, but once you kind of knock a little bit, you figure out it's not really working so well, because resources haven't been put there, or whatever the root cause might be. So what we learned is welcoming new ways of thinking is really inevitable. It is so needed. And I think that applies also to 1325. We really need to get the ladies at the table in all at all various levels in the decision-making process. Then plans are on paper, if at all. Reality teaches daily lessons. There's really, it sounds a little bit hard, but when we look how many crisis plans you have, whether it's for the influenza pandemic, or it's, you know, for the refugee crisis, or whatever it is, it's paper. Unless it is exercised and really kind of work in progress, there will be most likely a failure at the end. Just try it with the fire alarm. How many of you are having regular fire alarms? Do you know where you need to go when the fire alarm goes off? This is just a small exercise, but I think it's really incredibly enlightening of what is known and what one thinks is actually known, and what's the reality then. There is a lack of holistic planning. There is a lack of really intersectorial, and I cannot emphasize it enough. This intersectorial communication. We all are experts in our own fields, respectively, and we do speak a different language. We do have our backgrounds, and we do have certain perceptions, and that's beautiful. It needs just to be combined so everybody knows what the other one is actually talking about. So we can all work for a common goal. Or the high-level meetings. There is a variety of high-level meetings, and sometimes what I found is there's a lot of talk, but only little action. And there's a lot of management heads, but there's only a few people who are then supposed to carry out the operations. And that really makes it very difficult, because if you do not engage the ground level, it's not going to work. Then talking versus doing, and that comes back again. Then one says leaders. I think we are all leaders. Everybody is a leader. And it starts with lead thyself. And I really would like to emphasize on the great book. It's called The Rise and Fall of Nations. It talks basically about the economics, but let's face it, and every single crisis is about economics. Our whole life is in one way or the other influenced by economics. Even the availability of resources at healthcare settings, or in the peace building process, is based on resources. So I really would like to encourage whoever has the time to read this book by Ruchir Sharma, is the author. And then the crisis management structure. Is this actually something which is already being practiced? Because we do have so many incredibly people who would like to work and help, like civil society, but if they do not feel engaged, and that comes back to leadership, it comes back to political will, it comes back to the legal frame, it comes back to communication and building the trust. That's for me the key. That's the number one. If I have trust that we are all working together, but I can actually put myself in the hands of somebody else who will support me, and I support that other person or that collective, people will be more likely to follow. So that comes back to a clear message. Who do we actually want to address? And what I also learned from Ebola, for instance, because even highly educated people were not sure, whether what's happening to their relatives, because there are certain traditions attached. people did not follow what was supposed to be the actual practice or the recommended practice. So we might sometimes have messages which do not reach out to those because they do not come from the communities themselves. So it's not about the quantity of social mobilization, but it's about the quality. That means one needs to deal with fake news. One needs to make sure that the data quality is there and that the data we are using for certain messages are actually being used in a proper way. And that again comes then back to building trust, communicating, engaging everybody. And I think that's what I wanted to share because it's across the countries and across the experiences I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I fully agree. Communication is key. So I hope that we can get our audience questions now. So in regard to bigger questions that you might.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry.
No worries. No worries. You just popped up back on the camera. So yeah, as I was saying, to just kind of either in response directly to the talks, panelists, but also, of course, you're welcome to bring in your own experience and observations. And I think we have 2 questions already that Rebecca has collected.
Exactly. May I start already?
Go ahead, please.
Okay, because the first 2 questions are coming from Sushabon, sorry for the pronunciation, Parida. And the 2 questions go directly to Nothando. You mentioned lobbying was key to help women representation in CSOs during the signing of the peace agreement. Can you elaborate on this? Like who was lobbying and what did they lobby for? Is this a strategy not effective in increasing participation now? And the second question, does higher representation by women actually help the situation on the ground? Do you feel that the particular women who are represented by women in legislature live better lives compared with other women? So maybe this is a question about perpetuation of stereotypes. Thank you for this.
May I begin to respond?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, because the questions were addressed to you.
Okay, sure. I'll begin with the issue of lobbying and how that came about. And unfortunately, fortunately, many of the women that actually were part of the negotiations for at least for this 2018 agreement went to Khartoum and later to Addis Ababa and were for the most part self-funded, or they were fully funded by the UN and sponsoring governments. Many of the women that were part of, that were lobbying for this 35% went there on their own. And this sort of came about to great sacrifice, great personal sacrifice on their end. And that meant that women's engagement was often very ad hoc, and that it was not consistent. And we could also say that because of this, their impact could also not have been as wide and as broad as if their funding had been more consistent. Secondly, on the issue of whether the representation, whether the presence of women in certain political position has any bearing on the ground, that's one of the areas that I know a lot of international partners are working on. The United Nations mission in South Sudan, along with the African Union mission, has a program on, it's called the Political Parties Forum. And ultimately what this program seeks to do is to professionalize the political parties, but also there's an aspect of engaging with political parties for them to to create sort of stronger ties with the grassroots, and for them to, and for also for the ownership for local South Sudanese people to feel that their agendas are being represented by political parties. And it is to kind of strengthen this state-society relations. Currently, the national legislature has not been appointed, so we don't yet know what the implication of having, and let's hope that there'll be 35% women's representation, at least at a bare minimum. So we don't quite know yet what the effect of that will be, but the seeds are being planted to ensure that women's representation is representative of women on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did any of the other panelists wanted to jump in on that? Otherwise, we move on to the next questions. Okay. So are there any thoughts, comments from the audience? You can either signal by hand or just unmute yourself.
If this is not the case, I want to jump in, maybe.
Okay.
And ask Julia a question, because you mentioned that you focus in Georgia about regionalization, localization of the implementation process of WPS, and because all of you mentioned already that with the implementation process, we have a lack of political support, or there's an ideological barrier, obstacles, and the political will is missing. So do you think this approach of localization and regionalization is possible to transfer on a not global level, but that we change the system itself when we see the implementation process of this agenda? Do you think is possible? Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Difficult question. What I feel that when you write even very good document, and I think that 1325 is one of the easiest documents written and approved by UN, but even its easiest document is written by UN language. And even when you have the National Action Plan, it's written in Georgian language, but this Georgian language also needs to be understood and need to be translated from Georgian into Georgian that people will understand. What does this means for me as for women living in conflict area? What this plan needs for my neighbor, or I don't know what. So I think that one of localization aims is to translate resolutions and induced by resolutions. For me, for instance, 2242 is very important resolution, yes, because it talks about possibilities to advise to Security Council. And we have now this case when many of women's organizations tried to advise to Security Council not to approve new resolution, and it was accepted. So, to understand different resolutions, you need to make localization not only to put it in budget and in project, but also that people will understand why they need this resolution. That they will not look on this like something additional burden when somebody from capital is going and spending your time where you can spend with your children or your husband or your livestock in the field, just to put tick on your pet. So we tried to make, first of all, support for this from ground. Because political support in Georgia, political support we do have for 1325, but it's like vertical column. So this is the people who are responsible for women's participation, for gender equality law. We have wonderful package of documents, and it's vertical column on the left and right. It's not such a big interest to this and to women's participation and to 1325. Also, we see 1325 as universal instrument because we do not have another document which will deal with conflict. Concerning regionalization, If in territory of Georgia, which is controlled by central government, everything is okay with National Action Plan and with women participation, officially, I mean. For separated areas, it's much more difficult. And when women's organizations try to put into agenda the same 1325, they have that we are unrecognized, where we need to use resolution 1325 if UN is not recognizing us and answering our needs. And here is useful, first of all, localization, because you can go to communities and introduce these issues of 1325 to communities, but also regionalization is very useful because you create framework which is not only Georgian framework, which will not be acceptable, for instance, for my Abkhazian colleagues, with all us, our mutual respect, but it's regional framework where everybody are equal and where you can see like independent voice, I will say. It's a little bit sensitive what I'm saying now, but it's our feeling that we need to create as much as possible formats in which women voices will be heard and answered. And here resolution 1325 is good instrument because we do not have other instruments. Let's say like this. So, and my loved global study in which I participated, which collected voices really from all over the world. It was African consultations, there were consultations in Asia, in Americas, and this woman with whom later we were working in Nigeria, in Uganda, in our places in Africa. I less had experience in countries of Asia, but in our region with Ukraine, we saw the same problem. So women need space, the space should be somehow secured for them, and then this voice which we verbalize in this space should be brought to decision table. If we are not in decision table, it should be some mechanism. Till now, it was nothing better than 1325 imagined, and it's why I think that we need to create additional instruments around, but use 1325 always as a framework because it's accepted by UN, by NATO, by EU. Everybody has action plans on this, and we can use these action plans to promote women's rights, women participation, and peace, and sustainable peace, how women see this peace. It's why I think regionalization and localization are two sides of the same medal. Thank you. Sorry, I was talking too much, but it's very sensitive issue for us. How to include women who are not included yet.
Thank you very much. And no, of course, I wasn't talking too much. Are there any other questions or comments? I think Erika is indicating.
Yes. If I may add on here, I really appreciate very much Julia's comments, because it actually was and is the case in Rwanda from the studies I've done there, because it's similar. You have to engage the grassroots throughout all the levels, and the people do speak different languages. So the meaning of one word, even though it might seem the same, might be completely different depending on how it is perceived. Another observation made is it's conflict. There is the need for mental health. There's the need for psychosocial support for those who are actually engaged, and that means everybody. There's also the need for a framework which provides that safe space, as Julia was mentioning, because otherwise people will be sitting around the table, but there is no real room for trustworthy talks. Things do take time. There needs to be space for trial and error, because frames and action plans, what I'm seeing is they are a little bit stiff. They are very goal-oriented. And sometimes what you start out with might actually change throughout the course. So far, I haven't seen too much flexibility to really adapt to the local needs. And I think this is something I also learned throughout time. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. if there's no other questions or comments from the audience, I would also like to give notes the final word, because I think this would kind of wrap the main part of our panel up quite nicely. If you have any thoughts or comments on what we've just discussed, especially with regard to the link between the global and the local level, or in the case of the Southern Caucasus, the regional level, what is your point? What is your assessment of how well that link works in regard to WPS work? Is it possible to feed back experiences from the work, from the way this translation process is conducted in a given country, back into the wider global policy debate? Do you have any experiences on this?
Thank you, Andrea. And I think to kind of close off on my end, I think a sustained commitment, as well as strategies and resources, are needed at all levels, from global trickling down to the national, trickling down to the women's organizations that are truly implementing this agenda, and to ensure that the women's participation is not only ongoing and that it happens, but that it's meaningful and that it's maximized. I think one of the things that I'd like to really hearken on is the fact that funding, it's how key it is to fund initiatives that promote connections and coalitions between women's movements and organizations. So that is women's organizations at the national level with regional platforms and continental platforms. And this would include building on, existing initiatives and facilitating those links between communities and states and national levels, and supporting the development of joint positions. And I think that that's something that's possible. In terms of on the political front, I think it's really key for regional actors, whether it is the IGAD in the case of South Sudan, or the African Union and the United Nations, to really hold the South Sudanese government accountable to the 35% quota for women's representation, and to take opportunities to speak to South Sudanese leaders to ensure that they abide by it. And I think it's really key for all actors to remain seized of this issue. And I think sometimes I think if we get a bit disillusioned, but I can say from the ground is that the international community has a lot of influence in terms of how political actors behave and the norms that they put forth in their countries. I think I would end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your contributions, for your talks, and also for engaging with all these questions that have been thrown at you from different directions. In a normal venue, before heading out for drinks, I would now ask the audience to clap and to thank our panelists, to also thank our organizer, Rebecca Trixa and Shapka, for bringing us all together, and of course also the city of Vienna. Ideally, we would all now be in Vienna and take a nice drink or just have a chat outside. That isn't possible. But I hope you will join me wherever you are in thanking our panelists, and perhaps you could be invited, or you could be interested in just staying on in this chat group and having a bit of an informal chat, networking, getting to know. Maybe there's other questions that you would like to ask and haven't had a chance yet. So you're very welcome and invited to please stay on and continue our conversation.